All right, so my name is Jesse, and welcome back to the Conservation Stories Canada interviews. It has been so exciting featuring some of Canada's rising stars, covering so many different stories, coast to coast, of all the work being done for conservation across Canada. I'm thrilled today to be joined by Lauren Eckert. So again, I've been talking to some of the rising stars of Canada's conservation movement, and every time there's anything happening, Lauren is involved, which is really fun for me. To see her name and absolutely everything. And so, Lauren, thank you so much for spending some time with me today. I really appreciate you coming in for this.
Thank you so much, Jesse, for the glowing introduction. You've got my imposter syndrome raging already. Tega also says hello. He is certain that I must be talking to him if I'm in the house talking. But I'm thrilled to be here today. I love this project, and I'm really keen to be part of it.
Well, thank you so much. And while I know quite a bit about what you do, for an audience that's tuning in for the first time, can you explain a little bit about what your role is and where you're located, what's going on? What are you up to, Lauren?
Sure, absolutely. So my name's Lauren Eckert. I am a conservation scientist and I'm a PhD student. And I am based in British Columbia, the land now known as British Columbia. Currently, I'm coming to you from Tla'amin and Coast Salish territories in Powell River, British Columbia. And my dog is really upset that I'm not paying attention to him. So as a conservation scientist, I am really lucky to have been able to experience research and ecosystems all over the world, across North and South America. And I'm also really lucky to be able to interweave multiple types of science, like social sciences and ecological or natural sciences, and multiple ways of knowing. Indigenous knowledges, local knowledge, and Western sciences towards conservation outcomes. And I'm going to let my dog outside right now.
Take your time. Yeah, no hurry at all.
Go. Thanks, Jesse. Classic COVID-19 work from home interview. So yeah, that's like a very broad summary of what I do and where I'm coming to you guys from. Like I said, I'm a PhD student at the University of Victoria, but currently based in Powell River.
So I understand that you've had the chance to work in the Great Bear Rainforest. And again, when I was in grade 9, I did a project in the Great Bear Rainforest. It's one of the most spectacular ecosystems, not just in Canada, but the world. So could you explain a little bit to our audience what it's about, what you got the chance to do there, and why it's such a spectacular and unique place?
Absolutely, yeah. So I've been incredibly lucky to be able to spend time in the place now known as the Great Bear Rainforest, which is the largest remaining coastal intact temperate rainforest in the world. I often get opportunities to talk with younger kids. I work with a 4th grade class near Chicago virtually, and I'm always struck by how excited they are to learn that they're temperate rainforests, that they're rainforests here in British Columbia in North America. So yeah, temperate rainforest gets a lot of rain every year, but it's a beautiful admixture of the Pacific Ocean, these rocky seascapes, these forest-covered mountains rising out of the ocean.
Yeah.
And what is now known as the Great Bear Rainforest, sometimes referred to as the Central Coast of British Columbia, is the territories of many coastal First Nations. I, in particular, was able to work with and towards goals of 4 Central Coast First Nations. So that's the Wikinew Nation, Heiltsuk Nation, Kitasoo Nation, and Newhawk Nation. And my involvement in research on the Great Bear Rainforest predominantly occurred during my master's degree, also based at the University of Victoria. And I was really, really lucky to get to engage on an Indigenous-led research project in which we, as a team, got to learn about rockfish, specifically yellow eye rockfish, which are these giant, red, bulgy-eyed, like cute in the ugliest way, very long-lived species that are endangered on our coast, in British Columbia's coasts. These fish can live to be over 100 years old. They're actually really, really cool. Don't get me started. I'll go on for hours about yellow eye rockfish. But they're also a species of cultural importance for Central Coast First Nations. And so these nations noticed declines in this species of cultural and ecosystem importance, and of course of importance on its own right. And so initiated this research to interweave Indigenous knowledge of these 4 nations, as well as ecological science, to learn what's going on with these fish, what can we find out about the history of these fish, what's changed over time, and how can we make sure to protect them in this Pacific ecosystem adjoining this beautiful rainforest, now known worldwide as the Great Bear Rainforest.
So not only does that make me want to get on a plane and come as soon as I can, but you've talked not only, outwardly, but just in general, talking about this idea of the place now known as the place, now we come in and live, settler culture. So Indigenous and Western science connections are a big part of the work that you do. And I'm really excited over this year to tell the story and to work with as many people like you in sharing these tales. So Indigenous people, First Nations, have lived in Canada for thousands and thousands of years. And increasingly, there's become this push for a two-eyed seeing approach, ensuring that knowledge and that understanding is incorporated into environmental and conservation decision-making. The lab that you're in, Applied Conservation, does this in a really big way. What does that actually look like? So if we're talking about saving rockfish, if we're talking about saving other creatures in the Great Bear Rainforest, what does that look like on the ground? Who comes in? How does that conversation get initiated? What does it look like when it comes to actual planning?
Yeah, that's a really good question, Jesse, and it's a complicated one to answer. I think one thing that I have grown to love about the work that I do and the work I'm able to read about being done is that there's such an immense diversity of ways that Indigenous peoples, nations, communities, individuals, Indigenous scientists, settler institutions are approaching these knowledge bridging exercises. I did my early bachelor's degree in environmental sciences. I was very Western science focused early on in my career. And through a variety of experiences, I was exposed to this reality that not only are there multiple ways of knowing the world that are inherently and incredibly valuable towards stewarding it, towards managing it effectively, but also that conservation is a uniquely human endeavor. While in conservation, we often focus on beautiful ecosystems, endangered species. The real work of conservation is understanding people, and it's fundamentally based in social justice. So in order to do conservation right, we need to recognize our shared histories. And one of those histories in Canada is colonization, of course. What a lot of this research, two-eyed seeing framed research or knowledge bridging research seeks to do is to recognize our shared histories and the need for decolonial frameworks for moving forward in conservation. And when I say decolonial frameworks, what I really mean is the building of new structures or the return to pre-colonial structures of knowledge sharing, of ecosystem management and stewarding, and a recognition that these projects where we share things like Western science and Indigenous knowledge are increasingly and need to increasingly be led and initiated by Indigenous nations, Indigenous scientists, etc. So really focusing on our position as settler scientists, analyzing all that we still have to learn and that we are learning from Indigenous partners in this work. So one example of how knowledge bridging exercises can work is the case of the rockfish story, which I told you about. That was research I engaged on during my master's. And as I sort of alluded to, what happened there was these 4 Central Coast First Nations had identified a local environmental problem among many local environmental problems that are being tackled by Indigenous nations on the Central Coast in the Great Bear Rainforest. And what we were able to do together was talk to Indigenous fishers, Indigenous elders, Indigenous youth, Indigenous leaders with questions that derive from the nations leading the research. And those questions, those conversations led to a team of researchers, Indigenous and non-Indigenous, and settler and Indigenous, being able to better understand what non-Western, what Indigenous knowledge existed about these rockfish, how the species had changed over time. One thing we learned from Indigenous fishers and elders is about baseline changes that are far beyond my lifetime that have occurred with these important species on the coast. So things like, oh, there used to be far more very large rockfish here. And when, commercial fishing started, or when trawling started, or when we saw the disappearance of forage fish, or when these ecosystems were destroyed, we saw these changes. And these baselines can push back, 1950s, a time when we have no scientific data for the region in which we were talking about, and a time many people working on these projects weren't alive for. And so combining that knowledge with scientific information. So we're going out on the waters, we're doing hook and line surveys, seeing how many fish are in a given area, how big those fish are, what their stomach contents are, what their sex is, stuff like this, can give us a more holistic picture of what this environment, this species looks like, and what it needs from us in order to flourish or survive. And I think it's really important to emphasize that in these knowledge bridging activities, we have to think about justice. We have to think about social justice and look for ways not just to subsume Indigenous knowledge into Western science, but instead to recognize that these are two equal knowledge systems standing on their own merits, on their own pillars, that when we can bridge equitably, can provide us incredible opportunity and a wealth of information to better manage environments and aim for better conservation outcomes.
Yeah, beautifully put, Lauren.
Thank you.
And so, as someone who's not directly participating in this field, as someone who's not conducting active research myself, certainly there's more conversations that I've heard both in conferences from people like you around Canada about these sort of knowledge bridging exercises and programs popping up across Canada. The federal government, at least outwardly, makes the case that a lot of this is being done. So don't pull punches. How are we doing as a nation? How is Canada doing in actually enacting this sort of thing and doing it in a meaningful way?
Yeah, that's a fantastic question, Jesse, and another complicated one to answer. I think there are a lot of scales that we can look at how this work is going on. And actually, back in February of 2020, the before times, right before the pandemic really took off, I was involved in a team of Indigenous and non-Indigenous scholars who published a paper relating to environmental assessments in Canada at the federal level. So these sweeping assessments that decide whether major projects will move forward, for instance, Trans Mountain Pipeline, and related projects that are massive in scale, that may cross provincial boundaries and may impact hundreds of First Nations in their territories. And what we found through looking at this one specific policy piece that has massive impacts for people and places and wildlife and ecosystems in Canada was that while environmental assessment legislation, which was updated in 2019, has improved in terms of the way it acknowledges Indigenous knowledge and Indigenous rights in Canada, there's still a long way to go in terms of how this legislation can actionably recognize Indigenous rights, Indigenous knowledge as a standalone source of knowledge that is valuable beyond settler conversations and beyond its relation to Western science. Ultimately, a lot of that positive language, while it's great to see in legislation, isn't actionable yet, or is actionable, but at the end of the day, project outcomes, for instance, in environmental assessment, are left at the discretion of the federal government, of the minister. So I'm relatively new to this conversation in Canada, and I have to remind myself of that a lot, right? I moved to Canada 7 years ago from the US and had a lot to learn when I got here, and still have a lot to learn. So I think if you're looking at a long timeline of what has occurred in the last 100 years in Canada, we have seen incredible improvements, and those improvements have been led and motivated by brave, resilient, continuously working Indigenous leaders, communicators, scientists, nations, etc.
Yeah.
So I think we can recognize how far we've come, but also recognize how much work we still have to do, especially settlers, settler scientists, settler governments, settler institutions. While we talk increasingly about nation-to-nation communications and Indigenous nations' rights to make environmental decisions and general decisions about their territories, we're not quite there yet when we look at policies like environmental assessment in Canada, which has huge impacts and consequences for Indigenous nations. It's really complicated, it's huge. And so you can look at the federal level and see all of these major problems we still need to tackle. And some of them are just so entrenched in history and societal values and settler institutions. You know, colonization is not a historical problem. It's ongoing in many ways. But we can also look at local stories like what the Kidisu, Hey, Wikinu, Heiltsuk, and Newhalk are doing on the Central Coast towards conserving and protecting and managing their territories, and look all over Canada at incredible success stories. So I try and balance my assessment of where we've come and where we still need to go. And I think for folks like me, scientists, settler scientists, the work now is to follow, to take leadership from nations and Indigenous scientists and Indigenous leadership, and make sure that we're making space and following that leadership towards fixing some of this stuff. While we're starting to get the language closer, the policies themselves still create massive power imbalances, sort of founded in these colonial ideas about who gets power in Canada. So, yeah.
Again, another articulate and beautiful answer, Lauren. And I know it's a topic that we could take for many hours. And again, I'm hoping over the course of the year to talk with a lot of people coast to coast in highlighting some of these stories. But I think this is a beautiful primer for the third issue of this series. And I'm really looking forward to hearing more and sharing some of these stories in links at the end of the video that we can share out in social media, Instagram, Twitter, etc., to highlight some of this so people can keep the learning going. This has been really, really exciting. Before we wrap up, I just want to ask one more question, which is you talked at the beginning of your presentation about getting the chance to work around the globe. You mentioned coming in from the US. And so, you know, with the theme of this interview being, you know, differing perspectives, coming in with an outsider's perspective and sharing that with a wide community, what has that meant to you? What has your experiences working in other countries done to impact how you operate here in Canada?
Yeah, it's I feel like my journey through working in different places and through growing up in the US has been one that has led me. I can see the crooked and winding pathway that has led me here precisely. I was born in California, but I grew up in the Midwest of the US in Iowa. And a lot of these conversations that as many people can see playing out in the US right now, a lot of conversations regarding Indigenous rights and rights of all people of color are very challenging in the United States with a deeply colonial history, just like Canada. I mean, I don't want to make exceptions for Canada here. Those conversations still have a long way to go. But growing up in Iowa, there were not a lot of the conversations that are ongoing in Canada about things like residential schools and Indigenous rights and decolonization. And so I went to a university in Indiana, and I loved ecology. I loved macro scale of thinking about the globe and conservation and, you know, charismatic megafauna, as we nerdy scientists like to call them, which is just a fancy way of saying big, beautiful animals like bears and whales. And I was starving to learn more about these things and what my role in conservation of ecosystems and animals that I cared about could be. And so I was able to work on a number of field projects during my bachelor's degree. And so I worked across the US on researching forest deer mice and helping on a kit fox conservation project, and, you know, doing a bunch of lab work at my university, microscopes pressed against my eyes all the time. But then a project that really impacted my trajectory occurred when I was living in Brazil in my early 20s, and I was able to volunteer on a Murican monkey conservation project. And Murican monkeys are wonderful. They're highly endangered monkeys that reside in the Mata Atlântica rainforest. This is eastern Brazil, or western Brazil, not coastal Brazil. And they're big. They kind of look like spider monkeys. And one way they deal with stress is by giving these like giant human-like frontal hugs. So they're a very charismatic species. And I had this massive learning process while involved on that research project, which kind of crystallized lessons that had been growing over my experience on field projects throughout North America. Um, and to make a long story short, essentially, there was a collaboration between the research institute, which I worked at, and local partners. And those local partners were incredibly capable of finding and identifying these monkeys that we as a team of biologists would take, 10 days, 2 weeks hiking through montane rainforests to stumble upon. And I was so blown away by the incredible wealth of knowledge from local experts to track, to identify, to tell us about the behavior of these poorly studied monkeys. And that solidified for me what had not been a clear recognition until that point in conservation and in ecology, which is what I've already articulated, that we need multiple knowledge types in order to make conservation work. But more importantly, we need to think about humans. We need to think about social justice. We need to think about who are we conserving for, and who has power in these conversations about conservation. And so, in retrospect, the trajectory from the Midwest of the US to Brazil, the rainforest in Brazil, and then to the much colder rainforest in Canada, sort of followed this growth and learning, this realization that I'd been sheltered from partially because of my privilege as a white settler in Iowa, that of course conservation isn't about preservation. It's not about, humans being totally separate from ecosystems. It's about recognizing that humans have lived in stewardship, in tandem with ecosystems for millennia, long before the rising of Western culture. And that we have a lot to learn from the people who are still engaged in those practices and tied to those practices. And that conservation can also be a tool for justice creation as well as it can collaborate with social justice movements. So yeah, I think I was a little bit behind on a lot of realizations because of growing up in the Midwest, and because my whiteness and my privilege insulated me from a lot of harder truths about the world. But through that opportunity to work with many ecosystems and many people in many places, I was led here to Canada, and I'm really excited about where these evolving lessons will lead me in 10 years. So I felt really lucky to be able to hop all around and now be based here.
Well, we're thrilled to have you, so please stay.
I will, trust me.
We'll cross that bridge in another conversation.
Another day. Yep.
But no, I love that you covered two of the things that, so far in my interviews and in my whole experience in science communication are two elements that are integral to conservation and integral to science. One is the huge impact of getting to travel around the world and experience other cultures, other ideas, other places in leading to really positive change here in Canada, but also the importance of focusing on local community conservation efforts. I mean, without buy-in, without support, without the interest of local communities, whether they're First Nations communities, whether they're people, settler communities, what have you.
Yeah.
Without that interest, without that local knowledge and commitment, conservation efforts usually, if not never, succeed properly. So totally. I'm really glad we got a chance to talk about that. And again, this has been a really enriching, exciting conversation. I'm excited to share a whole bunch of other resources afterwards with the community that's going to tune into this. One I'd recommend, which you may or may not be familiar with, the Indigenous Peoples Atlas of Canada by the Canadian Geographic Society, was done in conjunction with First Nations across Canada. It's a really beautiful, large-scale story available to kids and the public across Canada and beyond. So as a primer, I'd recommend that. And if you have anything else, I'd love to see it and share it afterwards too.
Sure, totally. I mean, I have so many resources that I'd be thrilled to share. One really quick and easy one is nativeland.ca. It's a crowdsourced platform that can show you whose land you're on. And I think that's a really big start. We need to move beyond just land acknowledgements towards talking about our responsibility as folks who have benefited from violent colonization. But so many people, I mean, growing up in the US, I was completely ignorant of whose land I was on. So I think that's a great resource to start with. And I also just highly suggest, I'm speaking as a settler scientist with settler positionality. There are so many incredible Indigenous voices. I could recommend many. Dr. Andrea Reed is a great one. Jesse, I think Andrea actually connected us.
She did, and I'm chatting with her next week. So perfect.
Awesome. And a couple other folks come to mind who I'll give you names of. Jess Housey being one of them with her work for the Crux Society. So endless resources, lots to learn from lots of people, and it's all available to you. So I will share more afterwards.
Fantastic. Well, I will wrap up the broadcast there. I'm broadcasting from the land of the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee, and the Mississaugas, the New Credit, which I know because of land acknowledgements in scientific presentations over the last couple of years, which is really exciting. Wherever you're joining from, check that out. Check out nativeland.ca. Check out the Indigenous Peoples Atlas of Canada, and check out the work of Lauren and her team at the Applied Conservation Lab. They are saving one of the most unique and amazing resources and ecosystems in the world. And so some really, really amazing work there connecting with community leaders and elders from the First Nations on the island. So please do check it out. Lauren, thank you so much for joining me today. I really appreciate this.
Thanks so much, Jesse. I've been so lucky in the past to be able to work on Indigenous-led projects, and I know members of my lab feel the same way, that we're really, really blessed and have learned a lot from this work, and it's great to talk to folks about it. It's always great to chat with you.